So, in this directing series on how to be prepared as a director, we've talked about casting, we've talked about your director's script. In previous filmmaking tip videos, I talked about storyboarding, and I also introduced the concept of the six visual components as taught by Bruce Block in his visual storytelling book. The next part that I think is important is to have a visual plan and more importantly, to have a visual plan cheat sheet when you are on set filming your production. So when I start coming up with a visual plan for my project as a director, I start with the six visual components that Bruce Block talks about. He talks about space, line, shape, color, tone, movement, and rhythm. And I explored space, line, shape, color, and tone in previous videos. Movement and rhythm is a little bit harder to go through, but that's kind of what I start with in terms of thinking about a visual plan for an overall project. So things like space, in addition to do I want to use deep space or flat space or limited space, things like that. It also is what is the size and shape of my frame? What is my aspect ratio? And then also in terms of figuring out how I want to showcase the space in the scene, I have to think about my depth of focus, which then might lead to questions about which lenses to use and specific focal lengths that will achieve it, or specific lens types that will achieve it. And then line and shape are more about objects and how they appear in the frame. Color is important, like what are the specific colors that are connected to characters thematically, through their wardrobe, through props, through the setting. But it can also be things like what's the color temperature of your lighting. And then with tone, which is the kind of grayscale of your image, we're really talking about what's the contrast levels of this project. But these are kind of the overall starting points. And that kind of starts me thinking about how am I telling this story even before I go into storyboarding. So I think the easiest way to explain this is through my first feature film, Acid Test. And I do this for every single project. For Acid Test, we start off in this warm color, some more tungsten, tapping into the nostalgia of the 90s. So I wanted to have that kind of warm look to it. And then over by the end of it, we are in a cooler color temperature. And so that was one of the progressions that I wanted to incorporate into the film to showcase the growth and the change of the characters. Another thing that you'll see is the aspect ratios change. We start out in 4:3 because we start out with some archival 90s footage. And I wanted that beginning opening to feel cohesive as a whole. And but then once the film kind of starts after the title, it falls into a 16:9 because I wanted it to fill the frame. I didn't want there to be bars or anything, knowing that we were most likely going to have a digital distribution. And the irony of the aspect ratios when you're in a digital distribution is that you're only making your image smaller within the frame, which is not what it used to feel like or look like when you were watching in the theater. So most of the film plays out in this 16:9 aspect ratio, but there are a few key elements where it falls into a 2:3:5 anamorphic aspect ratio. And originally I wanted to shoot these with anamorphic lenses, but we couldn't afford them in small, micro budget indie filmmaking. So we just put a mask on and shot it, you know, with the intention of a 2:3:5 aspect ratio. And these are all moments where something kind of changes her mind about things, whether it's the acid trip that she goes on, or her mother taking her to church, or the sex scene, or, these things at school that just kind of break her out of her mindset. These were a small way to tell the story or enhance telling that portion of the story by saying the aspect ratio is changing, pay attention to this. This is changing her. But then as the story goes along and she gets kind of lost in all of this and trying to figure out herself along the way, I also wanted to increase this feeling of claustrophobia. So eventually, when we get into our climactic acid trip, it goes back to a 4:3 aspect ratio. And then the end of the film is all in 235 because she's now, a completely different person, so to speak. She's changed. So that was kind of an aspect ratio progression of how to tell the story. And then in addition to that, wanting that claustrophobic feeling, I also wanted the depth of focus to become very, very shallow and just kind of feel like things are just really, really closing in. She's just getting very narrow-minded about things. And so that dictated that we shoot on a longer lens so that we would have that feeling of the shallow depth of focus. And so I created this cheat sheet about which lenses we wanted to use where, and having this plan in mind. And what was so helpful about having this cheat sheet was that there were times where we shot a lot of overnights where it would be 3 in the morning and my DPK would look at me and be like, where are we? And I was like, I don't know, but I have this piece of paper that tells me we're on scene 90, and so this is the lens we're on, and this is the contrast levels, and this is the color temperature, and this is where we need to be. And that served us well throughout our shoot because I didn't have to spend a whole lot of time thinking about things. We had already kind of decided on this visual plan, and the cheat sheet was just a great reminder. And then we could make adjustments if need be. Like sometimes when we wanted to be on the long lens, but the shot that, the location that we were shooting in, it just wasn't working, then we would have to switch lenses and then adjust. But we knew kind of what we were going for, so then we could change the f-stop and adjust accordingly so that we were still getting the look that we wanted for that particular moment. And I recommend creating a cheat sheet because again, things can get pretty silly on set sometimes, especially if you're shooting overnights. I feel like most of my projects end up having a lot of night shoots. It's helpful to not have to spend that time being like, wait a minute, where are we? Because you're usually shooting out of sequence. You need to keep track of your continuity, and it's so helpful to have this done in the preparation. And one thing that I will say going from a short to a feature is that the feature is just so much bigger than the short. And with shorts, to a certain extent, you can kind of wing it. You can kind of have a plan. I see it with my students a lot. They just kind of throw it together and, they can pull a lot of things off. But the problem is that as you get more and more ambitious projects, as your projects get bigger and bigger, and if tackling a feature film is certainly a big project, you can't wing it. It's just going to be a disaster if you do it. So I recommend this preparation no matter what kind of project you're going into, whether it's a music video, a short film, no matter how short, you want to have a vision for this project, for telling the story visually. And then that will be part of your practice so that as your projects get bigger and more ambitious, you don't have to learn this along the way.